Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Good Lawyers Gone Bad podcast. My name is Stuart Teicher. I know you're here for the story, so we're going to dispense with all the introductory stuff today. Just one quick comment about today's story. In today's episode, I changed the names of the people involved. I didn't have to. I took some artistic liberties in creating a little bit of the dialogue like usual, but most of the dialogue actually came from their mouths, and the content of what I wrote about is all true. It's just that the people in the story are still out there, and I just feel like they may be trying to get their lives back together, so I just decided to change their names. Please, please, please go and like the podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to Good Lawyers Gone Bad. If you could take a moment to leave a review, well, that would be great as well. Enjoy today's episode, The Dirty Little Secret to Solo Success. If you gave them a choice, federal agents would prefer to execute search warrants in the morning. There are a few reasons for that. First, the people you're trying to search are more likely to be home. Second, most of the neighborhood is still asleep, so there's less of a chance that anyone's going to interfere with the process. Third, and maybe most importantly, showing up early throws the people you're searching off guard a little bit. They're far more likely to say something incriminating during the interview that you conduct as part of that search. That's why, on a morning early in 2023, 9 federal agents were gathered on 118th Street in East Harlem at 5 o'clock in the morning. They were about to execute a search warrant only a block away at 320 Pleasant Avenue. The special agent in charge had circulated the operation plan the evening before, and the group was having a short rendezvous to confirm the procedure. After their briefing, they headed towards the target residence. The agents approached the house and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, apartment 3C. One of the team, however, stayed behind. Jamal Ortiz stood outside the house and waited at the bottom of the stairs. Ortiz wasn't actually a federal agent. He was an intelligence analyst for the United States Attorney's Office in Manhattan. But Ortiz frequently found himself on the warrant teams because he was one of the few people in the office that spoke Spanish. His role on this day was as an interpreter. Eventually, Ortiz got the signal to enter the apartment, and when he walked into the door, the air was thick with tension. Agents had already separated the 2 occupants in the house. The guy was in the living room, and the woman was in the bedroom. The couple was being interrogated, and Ortiz noticed that the guy spoke some broken English, but the woman wasn't able to communicate so well at all. Ortiz shuttled between rooms, translating for the agents. Eventually, the woman, named Sophia, she was brought into the same room with her boyfriend. The boyfriend was shouting at the agents, insisting that he was innocent of the things they were alleging. He grew more belligerent as the interview went on. But the louder her boyfriend became, the quieter Sophia became. Sophia must have had her head in her hands, in shock over what was happening in front of her. She must have been thinking to herself, "We've been doing it for years, and it was so easy for so long." And when the agents told the couple what they were there to seize that morning, her stomach surely twisted into knots. They were there to seize the couple's cell phones. And that is when Sophia must have had a devastating realization. "I can't believe it," she probably thought to herself. "They'd been watching me all along." The 161st Street subway station is one of the most famous train stations in all of New York City. It was opened in 1917, but it didn't become famous until several years later. In 1919, baseball was hot in New York City. 2 teams were particular local rivals, the New York Giants and the New York Yankees. That rivalry was fueled by the fact that the 2 teams shared a ball field. Both the Giants and the Yankees played at the facility known as the Polo Grounds, located way uptown in Manhattan. The heat between the 2 teams was kicked up several notches at the end of that calendar year, for it was in December of 1919 that the New York Yankees acquired baseball superstar Babe Ruth from the Boston Red Sox. Now, everybody knows that the Babe's move from Boston to New York created a feud between Yankees and Red Sox fans that continues to this day. But most people don't know that the deal also caused a rift between local New York teams. A guy by the name of Charles Stoneham had just purchased the New York Giants that year. For those of you who aren't sports aficionados, by the way, you might be thinking, wait, aren't the New York Giants a football team? Yeah, they are. For years, there was both a football and baseball team in New York City called the Giants. That's why sometimes people today still nostalgically call the NFL team the New York Football Giants. Of course, that's not an issue today because the New York Baseball Giants eventually left New York for San Francisco, where they continue to play to this day. Anyway, in 1919, a guy by the name of Charles Stoneham bought the New York Baseball Giants, and he was bent out of shape by the Babe Ruth trade. He knew that acquiring the Babe would vastly improve the fortunes of the Yankees, both in talent and fan appeal. As time passed, Stoneham continued to fume over the deal. He watched his Giants get overshadowed by the Yankees, and the anger brewed inside of him for months. But Stoneham had an ace up his sleeve. You see, the facility where the two teams played, the Polo Grounds, well, that stadium was owned by the New York Giants. So to exact his revenge over his intercity rivals, Charles Stoneham kicked the New York Yankees out of the Polo Grounds. The New York sports world erupted. It didn't take Stoneham very long to realize that he had overplayed his hand. Stoneham eventually retracted the eviction, but the damage was done. The Yankees decided it was time to build a stadium of their own. There was speculation that the Yankees' new home would be on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, but in the end, the team acquired a parcel of land that was owned by the famous Astor family and was currently being used as a sawmill. And while that plot of land was located over the Harlem River in the borough of the Bronx, the nearby Macombs Dam Bridge made it walking distance from the Polo Grounds. So sure, history calls Yankee Stadium the house that Ruth built. But it's probably more accurate to say that it was the house that Spite built. That's because if it wasn't for Charles Stoneham's rash, impulsive move, Yankee Stadium might never have been constructed. When the colossal structure was designed, they were very careful about how they placed the building on the site. They wanted to maximize attendance, of course, and oh, did I mention that the site was located at 161st Street in the Bronx? Yeah, that's why when the building was drawn up, they purposefully designed the structure so that the front door of the stadium would match up precisely with the opening of the 161st Street subway station. The stop is now known as 161st Street Yankee Stadium, and last year, 6 million riders passed through that station. Yankee Stadium isn't the only impressive architectural element that's located just outside the 161st Street subway entrance. At the very time Yankee Stadium was being built, a few blocks away, New York was developing the road in the Bronx known as the Grand Concourse. The Grand Concourse was modeled after the Champs-Élysées in Paris. I said that right? Champs-Élysées? I don't do French. Regardless, the New York version is famous for its remarkable collection of Art Deco apartment buildings that were built from the 1920s to the 1940s. It's one of the finest concentrations of that architectural style anywhere in the country. Today, the Art Deco apartment buildings are still there, but the grandeur of the past is, well, the past. The aging housing stock is in need of repair, and retail establishments in the area struggle. And the community is not helped at all by the unfortunate reality that the Bronx has a high crime rate relative to a lot of other areas. That's probably why one of the most common type of professional offices you'll see in that Grand Concourse area are lawyers. It's a place where small criminal defense firms tend to thrive. Well, thrive might not be the best way to describe them. Being a solo criminal defense lawyer in the Bronx sucks. Actually, I don't think it matters where your practice is located, whether it's in the Bronx or otherwise. Being a solo criminal defense lawyer generally just seems to suck. I was a municipal prosecutor for years. While doing that job, I met thousands of solo criminal defense lawyers. And you know what? I can count the number of happy ones on one hand. The practice is just brutal. First, the work is grinding. You're in court constantly. You're often handling dozens of cases simultaneously. You're shuttling between courtrooms, waiting for your case to be called. Sometimes you're waiting for hours. Each client thinks their case is your only case, and they call you at nights, weekends, whenever panic hits them, which seems to be always. You're just always on, and there's no one to help you. You're a solo lawyer. You're by yourself. Second, there's the client base. You're representing people who, by definition, are in trouble, and let's face it, they're usually broke. And that's the case everywhere in the country, in the cities, in the suburbs, in the rural areas. Ask any solo criminal defense lawyer anywhere in the country, and they'll confirm that it's just the nature of the business. None of your clients ever have any money. You need to get your fees up front and in cash, or you'll never get paid. And of course, most clients can't afford the lawyer's fee up front, which means you're constantly chasing people for money. And while you're scrounging for cash from your deadbeat clientele, your own bills don't stop accumulating. Rent for your office, malpractice insurance, bar dues, CLE costs, none of that waits for your clients to scrape together their cash. You are constantly operating hand to mouth. That caused an interesting thing that I saw when I was prosecuting. It was not uncommon for a defense lawyer to arrive at court prepared to try a client's case, only to ask the judge for an adjournment. An adjournment is when you ask the court to reschedule a client's matter. When the court asked why the lawyer was asking to reschedule, the lawyer would say, "Well, it's based on the case of State versus Green, Your Honor." The court knew what that meant. It meant that the lawyer's client showed up to court that day without the green. The lawyer didn't get paid. So the lawyer wanted an adjournment because they knew if they disposed of the case that day, the client would never pay the bill. So the lawyer rescheduled, got his fee paid, and then came back to try the case. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, that's a sort of dishonest thing to do. You're not wrong. But that's the mentality among certain members of the criminal defense bar. And that's something strange I've noticed about that entire segment of the profession. I've been in attorney disciplinary investigation for something like 15 years, and there's something I've noticed about the criminal defense bar. There is an entire underclass of lawyers who believe that the only way you can make a living is if you game the system. There's a whole swath of criminal defense lawyers that have come to the realization that the only way to make a living is to play fast and loose with the disciplinary rules and sometimes the law. Now, I'm not talking about all criminal defense lawyers. So the people in my audience listening to this podcast who are criminal defense lawyers, you know I don't mean you. However, you also know exactly who I'm talking about because you have been up against those lawyers in tons of cases. There is an entire subset of criminal defense attorneys who have flat out rationalized misconduct. Why do they do that? Because they think that the only way to make a living in that industry is to cut corners. Court-appointed rates are often absurdly low. Private clients frequently can't pay, and the low margins force you to take a huge volume of clients, which means you're constantly churning cases. Some lawyers look at the math and realize there's no way to make a decent living. And then something inside their head says, you know what? The system is rigged against an honest practice. And that's when gaming the system becomes, in their minds, a necessary survival strategy. It's not corruption to them. It's just what you need to do to survive. The only people who hate their job more than those solo criminal defense lawyers are the legal assistants in those solo criminal defense lawyer offices. People like Alma Santos. Alma Santos was a legal assistant who could not catch a break. She was in her mid-30s living with her mother, and for the past few years she was bouncing around jobs. Now, those job changes weren't her fault. You see, Alma Santos had the misfortune of working as an assistant to the underclass of solo criminal lawyers who practice in that Grand Concourse area. And that was a prescription for job insecurity. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, Alma had a job for a guy who is exactly the kind of lawyer I'm talking about. The guy cut so many corners, he should have been named Edward Scissorhands. I was impressed with that when I wrote that line. Sometimes the guy was so low on funds that he didn't bother paying the filing fees to courts when he sent in papers on behalf of his clients. In other cases, he missed deadlines for filing motions. In one case, he had a client who was sentenced to 4 months in prison. The lawyer was retained to appeal that client's jail sentence, but the lawyer never actually filed the required papers, and the appeal was dismissed. Eventually, the disciplinary system caught up with the guy, and he was dragged into court. When it came time for him to respond to the charges of incompetence, he just didn't. He didn't respond on multiple occasions. And when he eventually did file a response, he admitted that he didn't know what he was doing on many of his cases. The guy schlepped along, screwing his clients for years before he was finally suspended from the practice. Of course, that also meant that Alma Santos lost her job. Not to worry, though, because Alma ended up getting hired by the lawyer who took over all of that suspended lawyer's active cases. And that worked out fine. Until the second lawyer ran out of money to pay his staff and had to let everyone go. Alma was caught up in that seedy underbelly of the criminal defense practice. She probably lost hope that she'd ever find a decent job. And then it happened. A paralegal she knew hooked her up with a job for a lawyer who seemed to be different from all of the others. Yes, his office was located on Grand Concourse. And yes, he did criminal defense. But there was one huge difference with this guy. Victor Serrano was actually making money. Victor Serrano grew up in the Bronx. After being admitted to the bar, he would launch what would become a 4-decade career in criminal defense. But Serrano wasn't just a courtroom lawyer. He became a prominent voice in the legal community as well. He once served as president of the Hispanic National Bar Association for the New York region, and he was a frequent lecturer for the American Bar Association on legal ethics. Alma must have been thrilled to get the job working for Victor Serrano. His practice was different from all the other jokers that she had worked for in one key way. Victor had a steady stream of clients and a nice cash flow. Victor Serrano had cracked the code for running a successful small criminal defense firm. The secret component was referrals. Victor Serrano knew that the lifeblood of any small business, even if that small business was a law office, is getting other people to refer clients to your practice. So Victor Serrano created a referral machine. He had a network of people sending criminal clients his way. Narcotics cases, money laundering cases, assaults, you name it. And since a lot of those matters were criminal defense of federal crimes, Victor Serrano often found himself in downtown Manhattan at the building known as 500 Pearl Street. I wrote a book about the crash and burn of super lawyer F. Lee Bailey. He's the lawyer who represented The Fugitive, you know, that movie with Harrison Ford. He was also on O.J. Simpson's Dream Team. I'm in the process of actually publishing it now, and when it's out, I'll let you know. I'm probably going to do an audio version of it as well. So at one point in his career, Bailey got into a pissing contest with his law partner. It's really not fair to say that it was a pissing contest. It was a massive clash of egos that erupted into a years-long legal battle filled with more animosity than you could possibly imagine. In order to write the section of the book about their volatile relationship, I needed to read some of the transcripts for that matter. That meant I had to go to the courthouse to look at the actual paper files because the case was about 20 years old and it had not yet been digitized. Luckily, the two men battled it out in a lawsuit filed in federal court in New York, and that's not far away from my home in New Jersey. There are two places where federal cases are heard in southern New York. One is in White Plains, a suburban town about 25 miles north of New York City. The other is at the Daniel Patrick Moynihan U.S. Courthouse located at 500 Pearl Street in downtown Manhattan. I was hoping the records were in White Plains. I mean, Manhattan is closer to my home, but I really didn't want to go into the Manhattan courthouse. And that's because I've had to deal with various government offices in Manhattan, and let's just say it's not easy. I remember years ago having to get a building permit from the city of New York. I had to go to the building department and wait in line for an hour, just so that when I got to the front of the line and I talked to the person at the window, I could get a number that would allow me to wait in another line where when I got to the front, I could ask the person at the window how to request the permit. It was insane. So I was really hoping that the transcripts would be in White Plains. They were not. The White Plains office told me that all the files were located at 500 Pearl Street, and I did not want to have to go to 500 Pearl Street. By the way, you might be wondering why I keep referring to the location of that building by its street address, 500 Pearl Street. That's the way it's done in these parts. It's an interesting idiosyncrasy about government offices in New York City. Nobody ever says, bring the check to the records department for the U.S. District Court located at 500 Pearl Street. They say, bring the check to 500 Pearl Street. I don't know how that evolved, but that's the way it's done. So I was not eager to go to 500 Pearl Street because I figured it was going to be like the building department junior. I'd have to wait on a line to wait on a line, and when I got to the front of all those lines, a mean person at a window would just tell me that I had to come back next week. So I thought maybe I'd call ahead to avoid the whole line fiasco. Well, my fears about dealing with Manhattan bureaucracies were confirmed the moment I called that office. I learned that the file had been sent to archives. That's not exactly surprising. The case was closed 20 years ago. So I had to request that file, and to do so, I had to either send in a letter or come to 500 Pearl Street in person. The letter sounded like an easier option. So I asked the person who answered the phone where I should send the letter, and he says, send it to 500 Pearl Street. I'm like, just send it to the building? Should I maybe direct it to somebody's attention? He replies in this exasperated fashion, like I just asked an outrageous question. Fine, he says. Send it to 500 Pearl Street, Attention Records Department. I wasn't sure why my question called for sarcasm. Whatever. I said, okay, is there maybe an actual person to whom I could address the letter? He says, yeah. I said, okay, who would that be? 500 Pearl Street, Attention Records Department. Right. Okay, now I'm the one getting exasperated. But is there any individual in the office to whom I could send the letter directly? I don't want it to get lost in the shuffle. Yeah, he says. Who would that be? 500 Pearl Street, Attention Records Department. After coming to the conclusion that there is a 100% chance of my letter to the generic records department being lost, thrown in a file, or otherwise ignored, I decided that I should probably make a personal appearance. So I said to him, all right, maybe I'll just come down to request the file in person. What time are you open? 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., he tells me. Now, that's a big swath of time. And courts in Manhattan could be a madhouse. So I thought maybe it would be a good idea to get there during a downtime, like when things are slow. So I said, what would be the best time to come down? He says, 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Right. I understand those are your hours, but what I mean is there a time of day when the traffic in your office is better or worse? Are you more crowded in the morning, for example? 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Gotcha. I hung up the phone and realized that I just lost 20 minutes of my life that I would never get back. I figured I'd head down to 500 Pearl Street the next time I was in the city, and I knew that would be soon. Once a year, I give a continuing legal education course at New York Law School located in downtown Manhattan. The audience is a group of judges from Argentina who come to the States for a week of courses that teach them about the ins and outs of mass torts and products liability cases. It appears that those types of cases are only recently being seen more frequently in Argentina, while we have a mature body of jurisprudence in that area. I teach the ethics part of that program. New York Law School is located in Lower Manhattan, and it's only about a 15-minute walk across town to 500 Pearl Street. Walking from New York Law School to 500 Pearl Street is exactly the type of stroll that would be in a New York City tour book. The route takes you through old New York, down narrow tree-lined streets, and past a series of pre-war city buildings. And at the end of that walk across town, you emerge dramatically into Foley Square. Foley Square is an urban open space bordered by courthouses on all sides. They're all intimidating government buildings with rows and rows of huge columns. The structures are so impressive that when you enter Foley Square, you feel as though you've walked into a film set. That's because you basically did. You know Foley Square. You might not know it by name, but if you've watched any TV police drama or movie about a court that's been filmed in the last 30 years, you've seen Foley Square. Law & Order, filmed in Foley Square. The last scene of the movie in Wall Street where Charlie Sheen is walking up the courthouse steps? Foley Square. You've seen it, for sure. If you cross through Foley Square and walk just to the left of the stairs that Charlie Sheen walked up in that movie and continue down another block, you'll come to 500 Pearl Street. Now, 500 Pearl Street isn't just a place where they keep the court records, it's the actual courthouse. It's also the place where you'll find all the people who end up becoming clients of those criminal defense lawyers I was talking about. That's because when someone gets arrested on federal charges in Manhattan, they're brought to 500 Pearl Street. The process is scary. 24 hours after being arrested, a person appears before a U.S. magistrate judge for their initial appearance. This is where the charges get read, rights get explained, and, most critically, the judge decides whether the defendant can go home or stays locked up. Did they get bail or not? The defendant has an interview with a pretrial services officer. They ask about family ties, employment, criminal history, and whether the person who was arrested has money for a lawyer. All of this information goes into a report that's given to a judge at the next step of the process. That next step is the hearing. The magistrate judge has 3 choices. First, they can keep you locked up. If you're dangerous or likely to flee, they'll throw you into a cell. Second, they can release you on your own recognizance. Then you're free to go and you promise to come back for a trial. Third, they can require bail. In that case, the defendant can go home if they post cash. If they don't have cash, they can put up some property as collateral. And if they don't have cash or property, they can get a bond from a bail bondsman. Once they post bail, whether it's cash or a bond, the defendant then has to follow rules like checking in regularly, wearing an ankle monitor, or staying within certain geographical limits. The scariest time in a defendant's life might be when they are first arrested and they're going through this process. But the most vulnerable time in a defendant's life is right after that hearing is done. That moment, when the hearing has finished, when you've been granted bail, and you start to contemplate what's next. That's when defendants find themselves all alone. They're in legal limbo. They're charged with a crime, usually one that could send them to jail for a very long time. And the question is, what do I do next? Who do I turn to for help? That is where Esteban Ruiz came in. Esteban Ruiz was a court support officer in the magistrate court at 500 Pearl Street. He was the guy you saw after the judge granted bail. He handled paperwork, processed bond documents, and interacted with defendants and their families. During his shift, he saw every person who came through that courtroom. He was there when they were at their lowest, when fear had completely taken over. And to each of those people, Esteban Ruiz was a lifesaver. Esteban was good with people. He was boisterous and friendly. He had a deep, gravelly voice that echoed through the halls of 500 Pearl Street. He was the kind of guy who made you feel like he was on your side. He spoke Spanish with the Latino defendants and their families. He explained things to everyone in plain language when the legal jargon got confusing. And when necessary, the otherwise loud man would lean in, lower his voice, and make you feel like there was a way out of the mess you were in. Alma Santos was at her desk in Victor Serrano's practice when her boss called her into his office. Victor handed Alma a thick envelope and gave her instructions. He said, "I want you to call a woman named Sophia and tell her to come pick up this package." When Alma took the envelope from Victor, it felt like it was full of cash. Alma did as she was told. She called the woman named Sophia and told her that there was an envelope in the office waiting for her. Sophia didn't carry on much of a conversation. She simply told Alma that she'd be down later to pick it up. After she hung up the phone, Sophia sat motionless in her apartment for a moment. She knew her afternoon's plans would now have to be reshuffled. She got up and grabbed her coat and purse. Before she walked out the door, Sophia pulled her cell phone out of her pocketbook and texted her boyfriend. She wrote simply, "I got a call from your friend's place." She didn't wait for a response because she knew that there would not be one. Instead, she just put on her coat and left the apartment. Sophia walked from her place on Pleasant Avenue in East Harlem to the 116th Street subway station. She bought a Metro card, went through the turnstile, and took the 4 train uptown. She got out at the 161st Street Yankee Stadium stop and headed over to Grand Concourse. When she walked into Victor Serrano's office and saw Alma, they exchanged pleasantries, though Sophia was surely not in the mood to talk. Alma handed the envelope to Sophia. Sophia took it in her hands, which were slightly trembling, and then, with the hand holding the envelope, Sophia made the sign of the cross, waving the envelope up and down, side to side. And then she left. This was the first of many periodic envelope exchanges that the two would make. And Alma didn't have to guess at what was in the envelopes for very long. That's because Victor eventually started trusting her a little bit more, and instead of handing her envelopes, he'd just hand Alma wads of cash. He'd give her fistfuls of dollars and tell her to call Sophia for the pickup. And that is when Alma learned the dirty secret of Victor Serrano's success. He didn't just get referrals, he paid for them. And paying for those referrals is a big no-no for lawyers. Lawyers can't pay people to refer clients to them because it creates a conflict. Here's what they're worried about. If there's a referral source that's making a lawyer wealthy, then that lawyer is going to do everything in their power to make sure that the referral source is happy. A happy referral source is a lucrative referral source. The lawyer doesn't want to do anything to jeopardize the money spigot, right? And that is the danger. The lawyer might end up acting in a way that's in the best interest of the referral source, which might not be in the best interest of the clients. It's a classic conflict of interest, and it's forbidden by the ethics rules. But Victor Serrano, he apparently didn't care about the ethics rules because he was throwing around cash to a whole bunch of people who were giving him referrals. The procedure was always the same. A client would come into Serrano's office for an initial consultation. Victor would meet with them, and the client would pay him the fee in advance and in cash. Victor would then give part of that cash to Alma and tell her to send it to the person who referred the client. So, as it turns out, Victor Serrano really wasn't any different from the other members of the seedy underbelly of the criminal defense bar who gamed the system. He was just better at it. But that didn't explain how Victor Serrano could be so successful. I mean, everybody knows that referrals are valuable, but they don't exactly grow on trees. No, Victor Serrano wasn't just paying random people for referrals. Victor had a guy on the inside. The United States federal government made Jordana Perez a millionaire. Not just a one millionaire, a multimillionaire. And what makes that feat all the more satisfying is that it happened because Jordana's company was helping poor people. Jordana Perez owned a transportation company that serviced Medicaid recipients. Medicaid helps pay for medical care for people with little means. But there's a logistical problem for those people as well. Not only can't they afford doctor's bills, oftentimes they can't afford to get to the doctor. That's where Medicaid steps in once again. The system pays for their transportation. In New York, for instance, the State Department of Health contracts with transportation providers to provide rides for Medicaid patients. Approved providers drive people to their doctor's appointments, and then they invoice the government to get paid for providing that ride. It's a good business, but it can be challenging. As you'd imagine, the government reimbursement rate isn't that high. Plus, there are some tough realities. For instance, the bus company only gets paid when the person who needs the ride is actually in the vehicle. So if you're taking one patient and you drop that patient off, the van has to head to the next trip empty. They call those deadhead trips, and they can't be billed. Add on to that things like maintenance cost and driver salaries and insurance, and you realize that the margins in that business are pretty low. But the company owned by Jordana Perez and her husband figured out how to make a lot of money in the Medicaid transportation business. Fraud. Jordana's company started by billing a few fake rides, trips that never happened. They mixed those fake rides in with a bunch of bona fide rides when they submitted their claim forms. The fake rides looked like real ones. They got lost in the shuffle, and the company got paid for them. Once that worked, the company expanded a little bit. They started lengthening a few trips. In one case, they took a patient on a short ride from the Bronx to Manhattan. Unfortunately, that trip doesn't pay very much, so they falsely claimed it was a much longer trip from Brooklyn to Manhattan. They billed the government for the higher amount, and they got paid. After that, Jordana's company was off to the races. They filed 121 claims for driving people who were dead. 184 claims for driving people who were thankfully alive but were out of the country at the time of the alleged rides. Another 419 trips were made by drivers who were out of the country at the time of the rides. Eventually, the government caught on, and Jordana was arrested. Over a 2-year period, Jordana's company made 161,000 claims for Medicaid rides. They were paid over $20 million. But the government alleged that about 40% of the claims were fraudulent. At least that's what they claimed when she was arraigned before a judge at 500 Pearl Street. While Jordana Perez was standing before the judge being read her rights and having the charges explained, her aunt was sitting behind her in the courtroom. She was there to be Jordana's guarantor. If the judge granted bail to Jordana, her aunt would have to give a personal guarantee that Jordana would show up for trial. Without her aunt's guarantee, she'd remain behind bars. Jordana's aunt's presence paid off, and she was granted bail. She went back to the holding area to be processed and released. Jordana's aunt was terrified. Her niece was facing decades in prison, and no one in the family had any idea about what to do. She left the courtroom and headed to the window across the hall to speak with a staff member who could walk her through completing the paperwork needed for Jordana's release. And that is where she met Esteban Ruiz. Esteban stood on the other side of the window speaking to Jordana's aunt in Spanish. He impressed upon her the dire nature of the situation. He explained, "The charges against your niece are serious." Jordana's aunt shook her head. "Yes," she replied dejectedly. "I know, but I don't know what to do for her." Esteban could tell that the woman was worried. "Do you have a lawyer?" he asked. "No," she said. I know she needs a lawyer, but I don't know where to find one. I don't know anything about this process. Can I get her a public defender?" Esteban said, "Sure, you could get her a public defender, but this is a difficult case." Jordana's aunt rubbed her forehead. Her eyes were puffy and red and wet with tears. Esteban pressed her. "You're going to need a good lawyer." I know, she muttered, "but I don't know what to do. I don't know who to turn to." Esteban explained, "Listen, I happen to know a good lawyer, someone who could be very good for your niece's case." The aunt replied, You do?" Esteban looked in her eyes and saw a glint of hope. And then he looked just past her, over her shoulder. He said to the aunt excitedly, "Oh, wow, wait, don't go anywhere. Let me come out there for a minute." Esteban left his post at the window and ran towards the office door and out into the hallway. He walked a few brisk paces towards a man he saw from the window. He grabbed the man and pulled him toward Jordana's aunt. Esteban said, "What a coincidence. As we were talking, I happened to see this man in the hallway. This is the lawyer I was talking about, the one you should use. This is Victor Serrano." Victor extended his hand to Jordana's aunt. "It's nice to meet you," he said. "I'll be happy to help you." And then Victor Serrano and Jordana's aunt sat on a nearby bench to talk about the case. Esteban went back to the clerk's area to resume his post. Before he got back to the window, he stopped at his desk and grabbed his cell phone. He typed out a quick text that read, "Sophia, you're going to have another envelope to pick up." The reason Victor Serrano had such a vibrant practice was because Esteban Ruiz cornered the market for him. Nearly every defendant that left the courtroom would need to talk to Esteban at his window. Esteban would talk to all these defendants charged with serious crimes, and right there in the magistrate's office, he would convince them to use Victor Serrano as their lawyer. And why wouldn't they? Here you have a charming, confident person who knows the system and is clearly there to help you. Meanwhile, these defendants are at their most vulnerable. They're scared, and they're confused, and they're lost. At that window, Esteban had these needy people right where he wanted them. Once Esteban got the client to agree to hire Victor, Esteban would call Alma in Victor's office. He would put the client on the phone. Alma would set up the consultation appointment, and then she'd make a note on a ledger card recording the name of the clients Esteban had referred so they could keep track of the money he was owed. He directed as many as he could to Victor Serrano. In many instances, these defendants had already been approved for free public defenders. But Esteban convinced them to drop the free lawyer and instead pay Victor Serrano. But here's the critical difference between Victor Serrano paying for generic referrals to some random person versus paying Esteban Ruiz to send them the client. Esteban was a federal court employee. That made the payments to him a form of bribery. This system went on for 11 years. Did you ever think about how a cell phone network actually works? A cellular network is made up of cell sites, sometimes called cell towers. These towers need a clear line of sight between each one of them. When the towers can connect with each other unobstructed, they form a coherent network. That's how a person speaking on a cell phone while moving from place to place won't have their call dropped. The signal coming from their device is handed off seamlessly from one connected tower to another. I said that the structures are sometimes called cell towers because sometimes the actual hardware differs. In rural areas where there's a lot of space and no tall buildings, the system is indeed linked by tall cell towers. But in urban areas, there's no room for those big towers. Plus, there are a lot more physical obstructions, buildings and other city stuff. That's a problem because the cell sites need to have an unobstructed view of one another in order to properly pass along the calls. That's why in cities, the cell network is made up of smaller antennas that are placed at elevated positions all over the place, on the roofs of buildings, on the tops of water towers, on bridges, on billboards. This network of cell towers doesn't just assist the people who use cell phones, it also assists the people who track cell phones. Yeah, the cellular network provides a wealth of information for the surveillance state. When agencies who spy on Americans want to get information about the people they're spying on, they subpoena the cell phone companies and ask for call detail records. Those call detail records, or CDRs, they're a goldmine of information. They reveal the time and date of every interaction that a cell user makes, things like phone calls they make and text messages they send. But maybe more importantly, and certainly more scary, those CDRs also provide the specific location of the cell phone when it initiates those interactions. The cell network records the latitude and longitude of the antenna that processes each call and text message. The network even records the way that particular antenna was facing. A trained expert could review those CDRs and pinpoint almost exactly where a person was standing with their cell phone when they made a call or sent a text. Sophia had no idea that any of that was possible when she made her cash runs to Victor Serrano's office. She didn't consider that every one of her moves could be tracked so precisely. She didn't realize that she was leaving an 11-year digital breadcrumb trail. Well, she didn't realize that until the morning that 9 federal agents greeted her and Esteban in their apartment with a warrant. When the agents laid out their evidence that early morning when they served the warrant, the couple had very different reactions. Sophia seems to have sunk down into near silence. Esteban had the exact opposite reaction. He was pissed. He was pissed, and he denied everything. And the more the agents accused him, the more belligerent he became. When the agents confronted him about whether he received bribes from Victor Serrano, Esteban denied it all in his broken English. He said, "I don't have nothing to do. I'm not doing any business with any lawyer." When the agents pressed him, he stuck to his story. "I don't deal with nobody. I got no deal with nothing." The agents asked him point blank, "Has Victor Serrano ever given you money for anything?" "No," Esteban replied. "Has he ever given your girlfriend Sophia anything?" "No," Esteban insisted. And he stood his ground. He said, "I never refer no money. I never got anything. I never referred nothing to him." But as the agents continued to push, reality seems to have started to set in. Esteban began to see the consequences. At one point, he complained to the agents about the possibility of losing his pension over this entire affair. The prosecutors were ready to throw the book at Victor, Esteban, and Sophia. And their case seemed like a slam dunk. They had expert testimony about the cell towers. They had evidence about the use of the Metro cards. They had bank records showing the dates and times of the deposits. But there was a key missing element. What they didn't have was someone to show how it was all linked together. They needed someone to actually testify about the link between the 3 people. They couldn't count on Victor, Esteban, or Sophia to establish that link. They were surely going to invoke their Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. The prosecution knew that there was only one person who could tie their case together: Alma Santos. Alma knew everything. It was Alma who got the calls from Esteban in the magistrate's court while he was directing clients to the Serrano firm. It was Alma who prepared the envelopes and called Sophia to make the pickups. Alma maintained the ledgers, and Alma got the instructions for the entire operation directly from her lawyer boss, Victor Serrano. The only problem was, Alma didn't want to testify. Alma didn't want to have anything to do with it. And could you blame her? Would you want to get involved in a mess like that? The prosecution needed her, so they tried to convince her to talk. Agents showed up at Alma's house, and they pressured her. They explained that, whether she realized it or not, she was an accomplice to the bribery, and that was a crime in and of itself. But all that did was shut her up more. Now it was probably in her best interest to invoke her Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. But then the TV show Scrubs made an appearance. Well, the actual TV show didn't have anything to do with this case. It was the subject of one of those episodes. Scrubs was a comedy about a fictional hospital starring Zach Braff and Donald Faison. In one episode, the hospital offered preemptive full-body MRIs to anybody who wanted one. It was a money grab. The hospital was trying to find a way to have otherwise healthy people spend money on medical care. One of the characters on the show, Dr. Cox, was vehemently opposed to it. He basically said that if you do a full body scan of people, you're bound to find something that's going to look bad on a patient, and you'll end up forcing that person to undergo all kinds of tests that really aren't medically needed, and it will just end up causing unnecessary angst for them. In other words, if you look long and hard enough at anyone, there's a good chance you'll find something that seems off. That concept applies in the law as well. And no one knows that more than Alma Santos. That's because when Alma refused to testify against Victor, Esteban, and Sofia, the prosecution started to look at her intensely. And just like they warned in Scrubs, they eventually found something that was off. It turns out that during COVID, Alma applied for and received unemployment benefits. But when she made that application, she lied about her income. She overstated her income so she could get a higher amount of unemployment. And when the feds figured that out, they threw it in her face. The feds had Alma dead to rights on the unemployment fraud, and everyone knew it. The authorities then asserted a renewed pressure on Alma to testify. They offered her a deal. If she testified, they'd give her immunity from prosecution for all of the crimes she was implicated in, including the COVID unemployment fraud. Alma took the deal. The defendants were charged with crimes for the bribery. Esteban was also charged with lying to federal officials because of all of those denials during the interview. It seems that when Victor heard that Alma was testifying, he knew he was toast. So he pled guilty. Esteban, however, did no such thing. The belligerent attitude he displayed when he was being interviewed, well, that carried right through to this part of the process, and he decided to go to trial. That was a big mistake. During the trial, the prosecution had Alma testify for 2 days. They wove her testimony together with that of the cell network experts and the federal agents, along with the documentation from the transit authority, credit card companies, and the banks. They laid out the entire scheme in excruciating detail. Typically, it went like this. Alma would hear the phone ring at the law firm, look at the caller ID, and notice that the call was coming from the magistrate's office at 500 Pearl Street. She'd pick up the phone, and of course it would be Esteban. Esteban would tell her that a client is coming in soon to hire Victor. The meeting would be set up, and Victor would meet with the client. He would then give Alma the cash, and Alma entered the payment on the client ledger. The cell network experts testified that on the day the cash was entered into the ledger, a call was initiated from the Serrano office landline to Sofia's cell phone. They showed records from the Metropolitan Transit Authority showing that an hour after the call, someone purchased a Metro card at the 116th Street subway station, and the bank records showed that the purchase was made using Esteban's debit card. Testimony established that the Metro card was swiped at the 116th Street station. Cell phone experts confirmed that shortly thereafter, a text message was sent from Sofia to Alma telling her that she's a few stops away from the office. A few moments later, MTA records confirmed that the same Metro card was swiped again at the 161st Street Yankee Stadium station. Federal agents then testified that the next day, there were cash deposits made in Esteban's bank account. Esteban's lawyers made a valiant effort at cross-examining the witnesses, but the truth is they didn't have a chance. Once Alma got on board, they were finished. Victor Serrano's guilty plea earned the lawyer a year in jail. He was also disbarred. Esteban Ruiz's trial delivered him a 2-year jail term. Alma, as I mentioned, got immunity in return for her testimony. And interestingly, there's no record at all about what happened to Sofia. It's curious because she didn't testify against Esteban, but she must have made some deal in the background because there was no evidence of her being prosecuted. I mean, it's also possible that the prosecution simply chose not to charge her with anything. But it's weird because there's nothing out there about her. Oh, and that Medicaid fraud defendant, Jordana? Well, Victor Serrano started to represent her, but he had to withdraw from her case when he was arrested. Jordana obtained replacement counsel, and in August of 2024, she pled guilty. She was ordered to pay $8.5 million in restitution. She didn't receive any jail time, though, and that's likely because she probably agreed to cooperate with prosecutors to testify against her co-defendants. Her husband, for instance, was also charged, and he got 8 years in jail. The next time you're in New York City, go downtown and see Foley Square. Chances are that one of the 1,000 cop detective CSI shows, well, they'll probably be filming there that day, and it's pretty cool to see. Thank you very much for joining me, everyone. Please rate the podcast and leave a review. It helps us get noticed. Enjoy the rest of your day. And Haley, drive carefully.